Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Unity FM 93.5. I am Shalina. So yes, we had a short break. Hope you're enjoying the show. In the second half now, we are going back to the Muslim history perspective. I didn't want to finish it because I actually was really enjoying it in a sense of understanding the importance of history in understanding who we are, you know. So with me to help me talk about this a little further should be Abu Salah-hu-deen. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam to our sister. How are you, mashallah?
Alhamdulillah. So jazakallah khairan for being so patient. Obviously I was a little bit ill last week, so you know. But hey, so you're going to help us talk about the aspects of Muslim history. With me I also have Andy, street preacher, in the studio.
I do.
You okay? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Abu Salah-hu-deen, if you could just give us a brief background on, you know, your experience with Muslim history.
What I found is with Muslim history, it's something that's been very misunderstood, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on what type of academic background you're really coming from. If you come from an Orientalist perspective, unfortunately, that for many hundreds of years, the proper understanding of Islam has been very distorted through Orientalism.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we have the typical depiction of the Arab coming out of the desert with the Quran in one hand and a sword in the other, or the perception that Muslim women are entombed, trapped within male chauvinism. So unfortunately, as I say, it really depends the perspective you come from. So a lot of the classical Orientalism was very much dictated towards, I would say, being very slanderous towards Islam.
Mm.
But at the same time, another aspect of Orientalism, which is very interesting, is it also depends on how the West perceives itself. So for 100 years ago, European women were seen as being virginal and chaste. Now we supposedly live in enlightened times where rampant sexuality is something that is predominant in society. You know,
Absolutely.
Now it's the other way around.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I always like to go back to the fact that, you know, me being raised in Britain, you know, an immodest woman was always somebody who had a skirt above her knees, you know, and that was only going back as, you know, as far back as, what, 10, 15 years ago? And fast forward, I can't believe, like, you know, 10 to 15 years later, you know, no comment about the way that, you know, some people addressed everyone to their own, that is.
Well, I think it was Margaret Thatcher herself who said that it takes 15 years for something to become a tradition amongst the general masses of the people. Well, I'm 40 years of age, so we've had at least 2 traditions now in my lifetime that have become solidified amongst the British population, if we use that determining factor of Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you know, obviously Andy is very familiar also with the aspect of how youth has evolved in, you know, drugs and gang culture. Now, in our off-air conversation, Abu Salah-hu-deen, we were talking about how the perspective of hip-hop it almost started. I think you came off with a very interesting statistic about the fact that if hip-hop was to have a religion, it would be Islam. You know, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no problem at all. I have to say, I really do look back as someone who is a classic hip-hop head. But the kind of hip-hop that I came out of was the very conscious hip-hop, I would say, of the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, where it was Harry Allen, who was linked into the very famous group Public Enemy, that he said if hip-hop had a religion, it would be Islam.
Right.
And if we look at many of the early rappers, there was a lot of heavy Islamic influence amongst them. There was Afrika Bambaataa, influenced by the Nation of Islam. There was Lakeem Shabazz, who was one of the earliest rappers to actually appear in video wearing a jalabiyah, a scarf, rapping about Malcolm X. Many of the lyrics of, as I say, the aforementioned Public Enemy talk about Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, Minister Louis Farrakhan, Elijah Muhammad, and that kind of classic hip-hop, it spoke back to what I would call a classical period of African identity, pre-slavery. Because essentially, what we have to do is, when we speak about African history, we're speaking about a people who, in many ways, since the beginning of the slave trade, have lost a sense of identity of who they truly are. I say this quite honestly. I am of Jamaican origin, but did Jamaicans exist before the beginnings of the transatlantic slave industry? They didn't. Jamaica is an island that was captured from the indigenous people of the Caribbean, was then populated by predominantly the Spanish and then the British, who conquered the island, then brought in the slaves from Africa. So really, we have to speak of African identity pre and post slavery. And what the original hip-hop pioneers tried to do was to make the music a bridge back to that classical period, but many of them at the same time, they were very heavily influenced by more recent period in history, which is the civil rights era.
Okay, so, Andy, you seem to maybe, I could see the head moving. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just listening to what you said there, brother. Basically, I'm looking at you're saying that there was a lot of influences of Islam in hip hop. That's very correct. I'm not going to knock you there. When you talk about the islands being, there was no Jamaicans before, there was no black Jamaicans before that. What about the Moors? The Moors were all around the world before slavery. Okay,
yeah, that's a very good topic to pick up on. When I mean i.e. Jamaican, I mean the Jamaican is a construct of the legacy of colonialism and slavery. The Moors are. Let me break down the word Moor, because some people may not understand it. The word Moor coming from Greek moros, meaning black. So what you will find is that the African continent, when Europeans went in, they saw black African people, called them Moros, meaning Moors. Now then we have the Islamic conquests of the 7th and the 8th century. And when these African Muslims went into Spain, what we know today as modern day Spain, Europeans called them Moors. Now the Moors, just to slightly correct the brother, there is an account from the son of Christopher Columbus where he does speak of a ship of Moors coming back from Spain. But what we can say, there does appear to be a history of Muslims from the Malian Empire. Particularly, there was Mansa Abu Bakr, who sent an expedition of 2,000 ships to America. One of them did return back, and they actually gave the information to his brother, whose name was Mansa Musa, and Mansa Musa quite incidentally staged one of the largest pilgrimages to Mecca in Islamic history. He took 72,000 of his people, and he took so much gold with him that he nearly bankrupted the economy of Cairo for 10 years, subhanallah.
Yeah. Okay. So clearly you can see that there is a clear distinction in terms of the contribution of Muslims at this period. I didn't know that you knew a little bit about history.
Of course, I don't just study. When people say about Muslim history, black history, Christian history, all this, for me, history is history. It's our story.
Yeah,
not his story. So I study everything. So I go all the way back to the very, very beginning, to the pyramids, to everything. So yeah, I don't really want to add to what the brother said. I don't want to contradict or jump in, and he makes some very good points. Yeah.
Now, in terms of fast forwarding today, when I look at youth, and we look at hip hop, because I'd like to tie in. I think it's really important that we acknowledge the power that hip hop has today to influence a young generation with something that had the power initially to start out to transform the identity of people. In a talk that you do that I seen on YouTube, Abu Salah-hu-deen, you really gave clarity to what was happening with the youth. Could you share a little bit on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as I say, the hip-hop that originally emerged in the mid-70s to the late 70s was, as I say, it was an expression of speaking about problems within the black community, but also offering solutions. There wasn't a glorification of gang violence. There was a recognition of it, and we should always recognize. But at the same time, it wanted to examine the roots of it and the ability to eradicate it. Now, what we see from the 1990s onwards, we see the predominant rise of what is commonly called gangster rap music. And unfortunately, I would also link it back to the reggae music of Bob Marley that came out of Jamaica and the Caribbean in the late 70s, that we saw that the Bob Marley, the reggae music, created what I would call a second resonance in African consciousness, and that's what hip-hop was doing. So the same way that reggae music was destroyed and was replaced by what we call dancehall, which was slackness, promotion of gun violence, rampant sexuality, that we recently saw in the conviction of Vibes Cartel in Jamaica, the same thing actually happened in hip-hop. So we began to see the promotion of the NWA, Niggas with Attitude group. Many of these, what I would call, they're not even real gangsters. They are plastic, they are character actors.
I just want to say, if anyone's obviously been offended by the N-word, we don't want to use it, obviously. We do apologise, but yeah, we don't want to use that word if possible. Abu Salah-hu-deen. I know you didn't mean it. I know you're just saying what the group stands for, but it is considered to be an offensive word, but yeah.
Well, does it count if I say it because I'm black? So maybe it's a little bit different. Inshallah. Anyway, so I do apologise. Okay. As I say, and then we saw, the promotion of the gangster rap, Death Row Records, Tupac Shakur. And unfortunately, Tupac Shakur was a very schizophrenic young man. He was a young man that came out of the tradition of the Black Panther Party, but unfortunately, through the big money industry that had become the gangster rap, unfortunately, he lost a lot of that revolutionary spirit that he had prior to signing with Death Row Records and so forth. And unfortunately,
I think we might get our phone lines blinging up here. Controversy, Tupac and schizophrenia. I don't think so. Really?
Well, what I mean is, and I think it's very interesting that Dr. Joyce Leary in America, she wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slavery Syndrome, and essentially said that post-slavery, the mindset of a lot of young Africans had been affected by violence and the proliferation of violence, which is very unfortunate. And this is something that is also in the works of Amos Wilson, who is a very, very famous black psychiatrist in America. And both of those authors have said how this promotion of black-on-black violence is something that leads into essentially black self-destruction. And unfortunately, as I say, with Tupac, his mother, Afeni, was a member of the Black Panther Party. So this is a woman that was very, I would say, conscious, understood the system that works in America is perhaps sometimes, we wouldn't say all the time, sometimes is not conducive to young black males, young black women. And unfortunately, as I say, Tupac, when he signed in with Death Row, that kind of revolutionary spirit we know he had, and also he was a very highly educated man, he kind of gave a lot of it away to become this pseudo microphone gangster, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some argue that there were negative aspects, but on the other hand, I understand that there are universities now that have been opened up in terms of, the way that he would structure his lyrics. There is nobody that comes comparably near him. And do you not think that that's maybe what our younger generation are very much attracted to? Andy, you work with that with youth, and do you see the big attraction with Tupac?
Yeah, I can see the big attraction. I can see the negative aspects of the signing with Death Row, and I would agree with that. When he signed with Death Row, there was definitely a change, but that's only because the music that was selling at that time was the type of music that Death Row were putting out. Tupac himself as a person, not just for his music, but his message when he was doing interviews and speaking about it was pro-blackness all the way.
Yeah.
He wasn't trying to sell people the image of buy a gun and do this and do that, because that was just music. That was what he was selling. His message was actually, we need to rise up and fight the system.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And you imagine he influenced not just black people, not just white people, not just people from different areas of the world. He influenced everybody to stand up and listen to what he was actually saying. And although he sold a lot of records, more things are Googled and YouTubed about Tupac now on what he was actually talking about, not his music. I'm not sure if you knew about that.
No, I didn't.
His actual interviews are more viewed than some of his songs.
Yeah, I could imagine. Now, maybe, do you not think that this is why our younger generation are, so attracted to what Tupac Shakur? Because when I go and speak to the young people, especially younger Asian boys, they seem to love Tupac stuff, and I think his latter music seemed to talk about more so the system, as we may call it. Do you not think that that's what happened in the end, Abu Salah-hu-deen?
As I say, I agree with the brother that, that there was two sides to Tupac, but unfortunately, through the power of the media machine, there's only one side of Tupac, that essentially has become the archetype that everybody wants to go after, and that is the one who appeared in the music videos and so forth. I would say, I think a lot of communities, I think predominantly the Southeast Asian community here in the UK, I think maybe the reason why they do look to Tupac in a lot of ways is because what euphemistically call urban culture is essentially black culture in origin. So I think maybe that's why they kind of have an akin to Tupac. At the same time, I think we have to start admitting that within the Southeast Asian community, there is somewhat of an identity crisis taking place. And I think this is maybe to a certain degree that a lot of immigrant communities do actually go through when they do come into a new environment, because on the one hand they have the pull of the mother tongue, the mother language, the mother culture, but yet they're in an environment that is sometimes, not all the times, in complete opposite of what is happening in the home. So it's kind of like, they're Muhammad at home, but they're Mo on road.
Yeah. And we were talking about this earlier, wasn't we? Andy, do you want to step in? I don't know if anybody knows. If you don't know what Andy looks like, I'm sorry to put you on the spot here, Andy, but
okay.
You cannot put Andy in a box. I walked into the room, went to give him salam, but then was like, should I? Are you actually a Muslim? Or, Andy, would you like to step in a little bit there?
Yeah.
No pressure.
What was the question again?
Do you agree in terms of when we enter in this whole identity crisis?
I think though, not just putting it onto one community or one culture. I think there are parts of cultures that we will steal from. There are parts of cultures that we'll embrace. There's parts of cultures that we'll neglect. There's parts that we'll steer clear from. I think that happens with everybody in this country now. Nobody has a real clear identity because we're so multicultural. Everybody at some point in their life has tried to fit in with someone from a different culture. Yeah. Now, when you put in it on the Southeast Asian community now, and you're saying that they love Tupac and they love this and they love that, and it stems from the African black culture, but then I'm white and I've been through that myself. Yeah. So you know what I mean? Where I wouldn't necessarily say an identity crisis. It's an informing and getting as much knowledge as you can. It may externally look like you've got an identity crisis, like you're trying to be something that you're not. Yeah. And the cliche, you want to be black. Well, okay, what does want to be black mean? Because for me, being black, I see it as positive. My children are black. I see my children as a positive. Whether I want to class them as black, I class them as my children. So it all depends on the person's perception of what they're trying to be. If I'm looking at someone and saying you're trying to be something, who am I to judge them? Who am I to say you're trying to be this? What's wrong with trying to be that? First and foremost, that's the way I see it. What is wrong in trying to be black? Yeah. You know what I mean? The only people that say those things are normally looking for a negative, not necessarily looking at the positive, and that's the issue. It's the perception surrounding what people are trying to be.
But with all due respect, Andy, as you said, it's to do with perception, and I can only speak as a descendant of the transatlantic slave industry, where that black and African identity was stripped away from us.
Of course,
to the point that where we would go into the church and see images of supposedly what God looked like, and when we looked at ourselves, we didn't look like that, but we saw white Caucasian people looking like that, and it created a sense of an inferiority in us. We didn't want to have kinky hair, we wanted to straighten it, we wanted to Latinize skin. So as you said, I think it comes from the perception you're coming from. So for me, I have a positive African identity in the sense of I do not believe it makes me superior to anybody, but neither does it make me inferior to anybody.
Then this is, if we want to look at the slavery, if you look at, I don't know if you've ever read a book, Theodore W. Allen, he's got 2 editions, Invention of the White Race. There's 2 editions of it. If you've read that book,
I do have the PDF at home. I haven't got around to read it, unfortunately.
Have a read of that book. Have a read of that book, and it breaks down the way people perceive others. It's a very, very powerful book.
It seems perceptions are definitely really important in this whole process. Now, Abu Salah-hu-deen, we are actually coming up to the end of the show, and subhanAllah, it has just gone by so quickly. You know, there was so much that I didn't get the chance to ask you. You know, if anybody wants to find out, I know there's quite a lot of stuff on YouTube, isn't there, for if people want to listen to your lectures?
Yes. I do have quite a lot on YouTube. They can just type in Abu Salah-hu-deen, which is ABU SALAHUDEEN, or they can always catch me on Facebook, which is once again Abu Salah-hu-deen, ABU SALAHUDEEN, and hopefully, maybe not in the not too distant future, I can come back to Birmingham again. Hopefully,
yeah, inshallah, and come on my show, and then we can continue this conversation on another level. I think there definitely has to be a part 2, inshallah.
Well, considering you also had one of my teachers on a couple of weeks ago, Dan Juma, I have to be the dutiful student and come back and represent.
Inshallah. Okay, Jazakallah khairan.